All right, diversity in the newsroom. Let me introduce quickly our three panelists, and then we'll hear from them. And I'll get into the why of what's going on in terms of making thicker, more interesting, more connected newsrooms in the country. Krista Thompson in the middle. Well, let's do this in order. Christine Emba is a Washington Post columnist who writes regularly on ideas in the opinion section. She's the author of a very provocative book called Rethinking Sex. That's one of many in your gift pile there, just from last year. Before coming to the Post, she worked at the New Criterion as the Hilton Kramer Fellow in Criticism, and as a deputy editor previous to that at the Economist Intelligence Unit, focusing on tech and innovation. She has a BA in Public and International Affairs from Princeton, and is really great, so enjoy the book. And the panel, next up, Krista Thompson is the managing editor of diversity and inclusion at the Washington Post, where she's also the first African American to hold the title of managing director in the history of the newspaper. She began her career at the Post in 2001, so it's been there a long while. After graduating from UT Austin School of Journalism and the College of Liberal Arts Plan 2 honors program. She also holds a master's from University of Maryland in journalism. She's been an intern, a business reporter, covered presidential campaigns, written about civil rights and race. She's been at the style section. She covered the First Lady's office and politics and culture. She also earned a feature writing award from the National Association of Hispanic Journalists and was nominated for an Emmy in 2005 for New Approaches documentaries, and has won several honors from the National Association of Black Journalists. And last but not least, Waj is a Daily Beast.
Dad of three.
Oh, come on. We're just going to keep going. Then this is actually going to be fun. So the Daily Beast columnist today, public speaker, he's a recovering attorney, he's a playwright. He has given a pair of TED Talks that, by my count, I think it exceeds north of 4 million views.
No idea. Sure.
He wrote one of the books in your stack called Go Back to Where You Came From, and other helpful recommendations on becoming an American, published in January of 22 by Norton. He's big on vulnerability, which is so great. Every time he's on a podcast or something else, it kind of opens up but this is how he describes himself in one part of his bio on his webpage. Okay, ready? Awkward, left-handed, suffering from OCD, and wearing husky pants. Wajid Ali grew up on the margins of the American mainstream, devoid of any brown superheroes, where people like him were often portrayed as goofy sidekicks, shop owners with funny accents, sweaty terrorists, or aspiring sweaty terrorists. So basically, he kind of gets into a sort of a different way of thinking and being, again, in the book, in your gift packs. Thank you guys for coming. Maybe just to start off, could you say a word about how it's going and why it's important to have newsrooms that reflect the diversity of the United States?
I'm happy to kick off the conversation if that's okay with you, guys. As Josh helpfully mentioned just how long I've been at the Washington Post, I sort of, when I think about this question of diversity in newsrooms, very much reminded of graduating from the University of Texas, starting at the Washington Post in 2001, in the midst of a conversation that the American Society of Newspaper Editors, that's what they call themselves then, now News Leaders Association, we have had so much change in our industry, set a goal. They set the goal in 1978 of by 2000 that newsrooms in America would look like the country. And just by that, they meant if you were a major metropolitan daily and that community's demographics were 20% African American, 7% Asian American, and whatever else, you guys do the math, that the newsroom would reflect that community. When you think about that relationship between news gatherers and the community that they cover, these leaders of our industry set this as a kind of gold standard to aspire to, and an entire generation had passed, and 2000 came and went, and the goal was not met, and the goal still has not been met, and it's been an ongoing conversation for a very, very long time. And even looking back at some of the history for African American journalists in particular, that entree into the newsroom came during the coverage of the civil rights movement, when you needed to have people that you could send to rallies and protests and into the community to be able to tell those stories. And that was, again, we saw some of, the first Black journalists in mainstream newspapers, and that history has also been well documented. But if you take that principle and enlarge it to how we really cover the diversity of America, you see the value in having a range of perspectives. And so as the country has continued to change and grow more diverse, our industry, I think, is in some ways still struggling to keep up with that. And I hope that's some of what we'll get into in this conversation.
Oh, you're looking at me, so Christine, go ahead.
Oh, okay, sure. This is on? Yes, great. Yeah, I mean, I think I'd echo what Krista has said. We've sort of, as an industry, been in discussions about diversity and diverse newsrooms for decades at this point, and unfortunately, newsrooms are still not as diverse as, frankly, they should be in terms of representing the populations that they cover, that they're supposed to be informing. I mean, I think in this present moment, and by present moment, I mean like this year, the past couple of months, there's been an increased scrutiny on the idea of, diversity, equity, inclusion, DEI programs. Like, do we want ideological diversity of thought, or do we want diversity of like sort of color in some way, or religion or background? Which is more valuable? Why do we have to advocate for one and not the other? And I think that often misses many points, but especially when it comes to newsrooms. I think diversity of thought is incredibly important in newsrooms. Obviously, we've all seen the backlash that the news industry, the mainstream media has gotten in the past, I would say maybe six years. Really, I'm just thinking directly after 2016, but even before that, about supposedly not representing real people or being one-sided. And to avoid those criticisms, to make news believable again, yes, you have to represent more than one position. You can't be seen as biased. And that's an ideological question. But you can also pan that onto sort of personal diversity. If you imagine news, the Washington Post, the Daily Beast, people are reading those, yes, in their homes, but also on the streets, in their businesses. We're getting those pieces of information on social media. And people tend to, trust people who represent them, who they can see themselves in, who they can understand, oh, this person came up in my community or has my experience, and like, maybe they know what they're talking about. Maybe I can believe what they say when they're covering faith, when they're covering racial conflict, when they're covering crime in a particular city that, surprise, they're from. I think that actually diversity of person is not just important, but I mean, necessary for a newsroom to achieve credibility. And then you think of how people work as reporters, what it takes to actually get the news, to get information from people. There is really something to be said about, the hometown girl makes good and then goes back to her hometown and can report on it because this is a trusted figure. As Krista was saying about the history of the civil rights movement and how that increased diversity in newsrooms, there's much to be said, frankly, for, during the Black Lives Matter protests, a reporter who can evince some familiarity with Black lives, going to report on those protests and being able to get that inside view. There can also be the opposite, too. There is a particular kind of insight, I think, that can be, derived from not being that person. If you say as a white Southern male reporter, say. So this is the example that I'm telling you because this is what I spent my weekend doing. I went to the Nation's Gun Show in Chantilly, Virginia, and so I just spent my whole weekend at the gun show, which was a fascinating experience. I encourage you all to do so if there's one near you, because it's just really interesting, but also you may see a slice of America that's not always well covered. And I wonder what the experience is like for the different kinds of journalists represented in a newsroom. I mean, I grew up in Richmond, Virginia. So I went to the gun show as, yes, someone who grew up in the South, but also like clearly a Black woman who like most people didn't really expect to be there. And I think in the conversations that I was able to have with people, and in the questions that I was able to draw on, I asked questions that maybe somebody who had been, I mean, my example at first was, say, a white Southern male who frequently goes to gun shows, all of this is totally normal. What questions would they ask? And what questions would I ask? What response do I get? And what response do they get? And both of those experiences are different and valuable, but it's really important to have both of those experiences, to be able to see a news event, a news item, a place, a conversation from a range of perspectives, to be able to actually have full coverage of something. And increasingly in a world where I think much more is being demanded from media, full coverage is being demanded because there are people who can now demand it in public spaces. Making sure that newsrooms and media organizations have the diverse populations and representation to do that becomes even more important. Sorry, that was kind of a spiel.
That was good.
But
It's good spiel.
Good.
Yeah,
back to you, Wash.
Great anecdote.
So I'm not as elegant or eloquent as Chris and Christine. I'm a blunt instrument. And so I'm going to leave it to you all. You guys, we have 90 minutes. I can do it the DC way, really friendly at the Darcy Hotel where everyone's Minnesota nice. Or I can be very blunt. How do you all want it? New York blunt? All right, even though I'm from California.
Who's from Minnesota?
I said Minnesota nice, just in the middle.
Okay,
Yeah.
all right. What are you guys?
I also want you all to acknowledge that I wore a tie, no, not a tie, I wore a collared shirt and jacket for you, which is a big deal. So I just left playing with my baby daughter for the Darcy Hotel wearing a jacket. So to answer the question, the state, it's in flux right now, much like the nation. There's uncertainty and there's discomfort. It's like eating something and having like an acid reflux. That's how the country, in my opinion, and our industry is responding to this question of diversity, equity, and inclusivity, which is now known as woke in some places. So this is the most woke panel apparently on earth. And as such, this is either the biggest threat to America, us three here, or this is a sign of progress, depending on your perspective. Woke is also shorthand for anytime women want to get ahead and want equal pay, when people of color want equal representation, when LGBTQ communities want to be stomped on, that's all woke. You guys still want it blunt? All right, great. Growing up, as Josh mentioned, the progress that we've seen. When I was growing up, born and raised in this country in California, the only representation that I had was Apu, which is a 2D cartoon voiced by a white man. And when you're starving for representation, you'll take a 2D cartoon voiced by a white man. Like, we loved Apu because we literally had nothing else. My father's generation, my father came after 1965, the Immigration Nationality Act. He came in 1966. My father's generation of Pakistani immigrants loved this movie called The Party. The Party, you could Google it. It stars Peter Sellers. Peter Sellers is a white British actor, if you've seen Inspector Clouseau, in brown paint as Harundy V. Bakshi. Yeah, I know everyone's like, your mouth just went, oh. Like nowadays we're like, ugh, brown paint, not good, right? So a white character playing an Indian in brown paint. But my parents' generation loved this movie. So we saw it like 1,000 times growing up. And so, we love that movie, and now we see it, we're like, this is highly problematic. And I was talking to another son of Iranian immigrants, because he goes, oh, dude, my parents love The Party also. We saw it like 12 times growing up. I'm like, why do you think our parents love that movie so much? And he said, because Harundy V. Bakshi, the character, was the hero of the movie and gets the girl at the end. And they were so starving for representation that they took Harundy V. Bakshi, and I took Apu. You fast forward now, people forget, we didn't have Fareed Zakaria growing up. That's a new thing. When 9/11 happened, I was 21 years old at Berkeley. Fareed Zakaria was like in Newsweek. And they literally, Fareed Zakaria one time said this in an interview, but he kind of walks it back. He says, I'm secular, I'm kind of Muslim, but I was like the darkest thing in the room and I was the closest thing. So they're like, you, Fareed, talk about Islam. He goes, okay. And when you're the token, like I was growing up, either the token Muslim, the token brown person, the token darkest thing in the room, you become the cultural ambassador of all your people. So since the age of like 6, I've given like 16 TED Talks on like Islam, Quran, women in Islam, Iraq, I'm Pakistani, like everything, right? And that translates into this industry that we're in. When you are the person of color or the token minority, fill in the blank, your newsroom, before there was sophisticated DI, and it's still not there, literally said, okay, you have to do your work and be really good at it. And especially for a woman or person of color, you all know I always say you have to Daft Punk it through life. You have to do everything harder, better, faster, stronger, smarter, just to get ahead. And on top of that, when there's a DI initiative, for free, you have to be the DI representative. So it was always exhausting. It was so exhausting. But at the same time, you're like, I gotta represent. I'm the only person. I'm literally representing all people of color, like all. Even though I'm brown, is there any other black person? Okay, now I'm representing black people and Asian people also, right? And it's the 2-3 people of color in the newsroom who have to hold on and represent. So that's how it was for a majority of our careers, because I'm in my 40s, I'm a middle-aged dad, so I've been in this game for a while. The fact that we have Mehdi Hassan and Ali Velshi and Alicia Menendez, like all these other people, Joy Reid on MSNBC on primetime, just to give you an example. Well, Don Lemon's now gone, but if you guys are here, breaking news. But for years, when it came to Fox, MSNBC, and CNN, the only person of color from the prestigious 6 p.m. to midnight time slot was Don Lemon. All right, that was it for years. Joy Reid, I think she got her show a year and a half ago. That's 2. All right. I say this because in the backlash, I call the backlash of the George Floyd murder, what you have heard in our newsrooms is so much wokeness. And I've heard my friends who mean well have said, it's good to be a woman and a person of color. We missed our chance. We missed our opportunity. Like my white friends have said this. It's okay though, we have to correct. But you could tell like the nervous tension in their voice. It's like the anxiety's there. They're like, it's okay though, we have to correct the record, but still, And I'm just like, listen, if you look at the numbers and the data, New York Times 2 years ago in the aftermath of the George Floyd murders looked at power and influence across all industries. When it comes to power, 91% white. When it comes to power, 91%. We're talking about editors, studio heads, the people who own the investment firms. So I'm talking about power and wealth, white. Now it's maybe like 89%. And in the past 2 years, I'll tell you, because people of color have our own bat signal, we're on the WhatsApps. And so the joke between us was, how long before this country strikes back? That was the question. So George Floyd, you remember there was a murder of George Floyd. Everyone started getting into DI. You guys remember that? Publishing got into DI because everyone started looking around in the room. They're like, shit, this does not look good. Oh boy. And they're like, we need a person of color. And they look out and there's like, any person of color here, put them on the brochure. And then you saw these remedial efforts in the past 2 years. So in the past 2 years, when this started happening, those of us who are the old heads, the graybeards, were like, how long before America strikes back? How long will this last? No one said forever. The time that we gave us was 6 months to 2 years. Because if you're a student of American history, and if you're a student of being a person of color in corporate entities, whenever there's progress in this country, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And usually you get chokeholded back. And so what we're witnessing now with the attacks on school boards and hospital boards and any DEI initiatives whatsoever is anticipated and what we knew was going to happen if you were a student of history. And this is happening also within, I think, the entertainment industry as well, because if you look at the latest data, there's now a rollback this year on DEI initiatives because people are like, it's too much. And so I want to give you the progress that, yes, there is progress. The fact that we're having this conversation, progress. The fact that Krissa is where she's at, progress. But the fact that she's the first, right, shows you how much more there has to go. The fact that women don't have the same pay as men still, the fact that women just lost a constitutionally protected right, regardless of your opinions on abortion, just goes to show you where we're at. The fact that the replacement theory, 1/3 of Americans believe some aspect of the replacement theory, which literally comes from the swamps of Nazis, the KKK, and white supremacists. I'm not saying that without an exaggeration, right? 1/3 of Americans believe some aspect of that. That shows you where we are. So I say this because some people might say, the fact that you, Chris, and Christine are here is a sign that DEI is working. And I've been told this at places like Aspen. The fact that you're here is a sign. And then I'm like, well, how many people like me are here? And they're like, still, someone told me, this was Aspen 3 years ago, shouldn't it be about bootstraps and how hard you work? And I'm like, sure, but some of us don't have bootstraps or boots. And then that's when things get really awkward. So we're at a section right now where I feel like the people of us who have made it, and maybe I've made it, I don't know, I always feel like I'm still hustling and struggling, like Rick Ross, right? But it's like, if I still feel this way, if I mess up in this position, I know for a fact that it will put my peoples back, right? Mm-hmm. And I know I have to be excellent because the forces who want to take this country back to 1952 are always looking at us to mess up. And I still know that even though we've made it, it's only the first Chrissa. And we still don't have the power and the wealth yet. And the final thing I'll say is that the benefit of having diversity, what I always tell people is if you're an American, it's in your interest to invest in DEI because the return on investment will lift the entire country up. First and foremost, money, as we've seen with Fox's decision today, the color green is the color that trumps all money. DEI in this industry in particular helps revenue and ratings. Okay, that's number one. Number two, especially in our industry, how can you understand America and report on it if you only see a third of the field? And that's what I talk about with diversity. If you don't have diversity in the newsroom, people pitching ideas, people giving you perspective, leads, the right people to interview, you're only getting a third of America. And I've been oftentimes, last thing I'll say, the darkest thing in the newsroom, the darkest thing on Broadway, the darkest thing at HBO, the darkest thing at the think tank. And I sit there and listen to very educated, worldly, smart people who went to the best colleges, but just do not get Latinos, African Americans, Muslims, to the point where there's genuine shock that Wisconsin voted the way it did in that latest election. And I'm like, why are you shocked? And what you never still hear, and I'm waiting for, this is a sign that we'll make it. You saw the Youngkin election, right? Suburban women were interviewed. Suburban is oftentimes a euphemism for regular American, which is another euphemism for the heartland, which is another euphemism for the Rust Belt, which is another euphemism for average American, which does not mean us. So we're still not there yet. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk.
Oh, that's great, thanks. No, let me lift up one more and then we'll turn to you, okay? So we've heard a couple voices just before you arrived. John Ward was mentioning Eboo Patel by name, this idea of interfaith rather than sort of Judeo-Christian heritage, thicker relationships across more religious traditions. Carl was pushing out the point of like the value of ideological diversity in the newsroom. I guess I'd like to ask about how you see the norms for what should be. Krista tipped us off earlier to this American Society of Newspaper Editors that has this report ranking where we are, where the country is in terms of just raw, sort of numbers and where newsrooms are, and they are not equal. But what are the norms? Why are stories better when newsrooms are more diverse? What kinds of stories emerge that are thicker and more interesting?
Yeah, that's a good question.
I mean, I didn't actually cite the data earlier, so I will now. I think, to my point, there has been a survey of newsrooms. We did begin to see in the last few years fewer newsrooms participating in that survey. I mean, after a while when the data isn't moving and the thing isn't thinking, then you just kind of want to talk about it in less. So I think we're experiencing a little bit of that, but in the 2019 survey of all salaried employees in newsrooms, about 20% were people of color. And we know that the country is rapidly diversifying and, not minority majority yet, but about 58% white. So you see that gap of, a good 20-25%. Like we're just not there. And in some cities and places, it's an even starker disparity. I think to your question, Josh, there are whole swaths of stories that you just miss. And it is racial and ethnic diversity. It's diversity of faith and religion. It's also geographic diversity, where people are from and the stories that they see there. It is being in the news meeting and having the people who are shaping the conversation for where we should invest resources and what we should be covering and what are the right angles into a story. You know, great example from our newsroom last week as we're thinking about how to cover in the second day story the shooting of the teenager Ralph Yarl. We're talking, you know, through that. What are the right ways to talk about this? What are the conversations? And it was, you know, an African American photo editor who jumped in to say, I feel like we haven't really heard from Black teens. Like, what is the conversation that they're having? It's like, absolutely, you know. People are entering that story and conversation from lots of different perspectives. And we had good coverage off the news, but you want to have a variety of people around that table shaping the conversation so that you don't miss what are really excellent stories, and not just because they serve that particular community, they serve to enhance our full understanding of the world. Like, those aren't conversations that all of us are stopping to have day to day. So to lift up those voices was a really strong piece that came together. But it's things, it's stories like that, moments like that, that I think can really just help advance, you know, the conversations that we should be having as a country.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've touched already on just like what the difference is when you have more kinds of people, more perspectives contributing to a story. You get more perspectives. You get stories that appeal to more kinds of readers. And you get stories that you might not get otherwise, but that are really important. I mean, just as Watch was saying, like, if you only have one group of people in the newsroom, you're missing 2/3 of the story. There are conversations that are happening on Twitter, in person, online that you wouldn't know about. You just simply wouldn't know that they exist if you were not a member of that group. But those are stories that are changing the entertainment industry, changing the way that people think about democracy, changing their opinions on, say, climate change, for instance. And if we want to actually cover the stories that are meaning-making in people's lives, we have to find them. And sometimes finding them means having the people who can find them, not just depending on ourselves. There's just so much that each individual doesn't know, right? And you don't even know what you don't know, which means you have to have people who are not like you, who know different things than you do, to bring those stories, to bring those perspectives to the forefront. And I think one of the things that we are struggling with still in newsrooms, and we're working on this, I mean, the Post is doing recruiting, many newsrooms are as well, is the pipeline problem. And I imagine we'll get some questions about this later. But it's one thing to say, like, oh, we really want a more diverse newsroom. That would be great. That's all. Diverse people, if you're out there, show your faces. Like, that is not really going to cut it, basically. I mean, some people don't have bootstraps. Some people don't have, the connections to get into a newsroom.
That's right.
When so many roles are like, oh, well, you should intern and maybe have 2 internships over the course of 2 summers. These will be unpaid internships, so I hope you have enough money to rent your apartment in DC and do this unpaid internship. Who has that, really, if we're being realistic? And then we complain that there aren't enough people of color or enough minorities or any ideological diversity represented in the newsrooms. Are not the industries, are not the companies themselves sort of enabling that by their asks? And even more than just the pipeline, it's also simply the knowledge of what the industry looks like and the fact that it could be a place for you. I mean, in some ways this is a self-perpetuating problem, right? And we talked about this a little before. If you don't see anybody like you, then it's hard to imagine yourself there. It's hard to imagine yourself in that role. Representation is valuable in and of itself, frankly. And I think that there's there are many pushes to sort of like downplay the fact like, oh, it's representation. It's just like a woke gloss that you're putting on the news or putting on the show. But actually representation simply matters for showing people that they can be part of it and that they are being represented, that their experience is valued, that the news that's being reported is for them too, and is, keeping them in mind. If there is not enough diversity in the newsroom, it's sort of the one person of color, the one LGBT person, the one religious person has to be kind of all of the news of people of color is funneled through that one person, or all of the news of religion is funneled through the understanding of that one person. Remember, that one person is still one person, and they don't know everything about the entire community of people of color or the entire community of religious people. And so if you're filtering it through them, you're still going to get some mistakes. There's still going to be a lot that's missed because one person is just, frankly, not capable of being the representative for everyone else, shouldn't be asked to be. And so we need more.
Yeah.
Like we simply need more for this to be a feasible arrangement that is actually helpful and useful to newsrooms in the long run.
Relevancy, authenticity, and credibility. If you want to be relevant, if you want to be authentic, if you want to be credible, that's why you have to invest in meaningful diversity. The young generation, the youths, the Gen Zs. I heard there's now Gen Alpha. Apparently my kids are Gen Alpha. It's something new I learned. A Gen Z kid told me that.
I just got the data from Jean Twenge. It's in her new book. And Gen Z is 1995 to 2012, and Alphas, or sometimes called Polars, are 2013 and beyond.
See?
Sorry.
Fact checking in real life.
There you go.
They are, for better or worse, they are more globalized, they're more hip, they have more information, they have the TikToks, they are the future, there's a lot of them. So, and like you said, the crisis of not just democracy, the crisis of faith in our institution, the crisis of faith in news. People who try their best, but no matter what you do, no matter how much I fact check an article, because it's me writing it at the Daily Beast, it's over. Right? And I'm like, but I fact checked it. I swear I combed through it. Like, they don't care. So I think in order to be relevant, in order to be authentic, in order to be credible moving forward with a diverse global audience, which is your audience, whether you like it or not, you have to invest in meaningful diversity. Meaningful diversity means substantive diversity, not just the tokens. Because oftentimes we used to be the tokens, and we know how it is to be the token. The token is the one black guy who works in accounting, who you put in the front of the brochure, and then you sell and say, see, we love diversity. Now, another reason why, and I think Christine was just talked about it for a second, but I just want to lean into it real quick, the pipeline. The college to columnist pipeline I will talk about. If you're the editors, and if the powers that be are all white men who come from 5 major cities who go to the same 7 colleges, what happens, not due to malice, not due to racism, unconscious bias, and just human nature? Oh, I know a good kid. I know someone talented. Oh, at my church, at my synagogue, there was a friend of mine who handed me a resume. And where do you think that pipeline is supplied with? It's supplied with oftentimes the same group of folks, right? Now, I cannot tell you how many times I've been in meetings talking to these editors, and I've said, hey, why don't you, I don't know, Islam is in the news for the past 20 years. It intersects with religion and national security and foreign policy. Maybe you should have a Muslim writer, who just happens to be Muslim. And what I got told, well, if you can find them, I mean, where are they? We have searched and combed the earth, and we cannot find this unicorn. And you could just replace a Muslim with black. I've had this conversation so many times. And so then I ask myself, if that is true, then that must mean that your roster of talent, you're telling me without telling me, your roster of talent is the best of the best on earth. Because if you have combed the universe and you have searched diligently and you cannot find one Latino or one Muslim, and you're saying this is the best of the best, then I'm gonna hold this crop to the best of the best standards. You better outright me every mother effing column. And when we are on CNN, you better trump me you better crush me. When it comes to the panels, the columns, the TVs, right? The TV spots. I'm just being, you said blunt, I'm being blunt. And then you see a lot of mediocrity. I'm just being blunt. And then you see the person of color come in when they get that one shot. And because of the situation that we're in, they have to Daft Punk it through life, harder, better, faster, stronger, smarter. And I can tell you, going to Aspen, I'm just using Aspen as an example, the few folks of color that come bring their A game. And we talk afterwards. We're like, have you noticed? Like, we did a really good job. Like, you kind of crushed it. Like, you notice, like we did good. I saw your pattern. You were really good. You were good too. You were witty. And you were funny. And I think it's because we realize we have to be so much better, that we sometimes do become better, but we still don't get the same opportunities, right? So one of the situation is if you don't have that makeup, the pipeline due to unconscious bias, Josh, it's not like they're not trying to be racist. It's the same 5 colleges, the same 5 to 7 cities, the same group of folks, and you only see a third of America. And then religion, last thing I'll say is, because I know it's Faith Angle Forum, you talk about religion. I have 2 angles here as a person of color. Apparently I'm something called POC of BIPOC. Have you guys heard of this? I'm now apparently the POC of BIPOC, which sounds like a sleep apnea machine or like Terminator sent from the future to kill or save humanity. But I'm also a Muslim, and as a practicing Muslim, Christine talked about this. You know, I literally got introduced on CNN 3 times in a row in 2017 as Wajahat Ali, the Muslim journalist. That was not in my bio. And I just smiled each time. I'm like, okay, like you literally see me smiling on TV. I'm like, sure. And then no one ever got introduced as, here's the Jew and here's the Catholic. Like, I was the Muslim journalist. And finally it took people on Twitter to be like, why is Wajahat Ali the Muslim journalist, right? And so, and the New York Times did the same thing, even though the New York Times never admits it. I'm like, am I your token Muslim guy? And they're like, no, you're just a great writer. I'm like, I'll tell you a New York Times story. There was an editor there who I won't name. A friend of mine, a white friend of mine, pitched my friend, who's very well known and a writer who just happens to be Muslim, to write about politics. The editor said, but I already have 3 Muslims. Exact quote.
Wow.
This was 3 years ago. And so I have Trojan horsed being seen, despite my, like, you know, I'm not the guy who said I'm the Muslim, but they categorize me as that. So I'm like, I will Trojan horse my way into the mainstream to talk about what I want to talk about, and I'll be your Muslim, but then I'm going to pivot, which is what I did in New York Times and CNN. And also, if you don't have a religion writer on board, and I can tell you real quick about religion, like New York Times only I think has 2 religion writers. Washington Post is like Michelle Borstein,
Yeah, we're
and,
down to 1 now.
and like one.
What did Sarah?
Sarah left, so now it's 1 in Washington Post. America, whether you like it or not, is a religious country in some aspects, even though it's a secular country. And I could tell you, without having that cultural nuance and understanding and diversity of a sophisticated religion reporter, you are missing a lot of the conversations in politics and culture and religion. And I could tell you that as a Muslim, especially during the past 22 years, the war on terror. Thank you for coming to my second TED Talk.
All right, over to you. Who's up? Anna Wolf from Mississippi Today.
Oh,
Thank you for having this conversation. This is something I think a lot about, being in the blackest city in the country, in the blackest state in the country. And I find
You're in
that Jackson, yeah. I find that we struggle because, like, the rules of journalism were written by white people, and we take these, like, emerging black journalists and put them in these newsrooms where they're expected to, like, basically adopt a white voice, it seems like at times, which kind of defeats the whole purpose of having, like, the creativity. We sort of, like, stifle, you know, the like diversity of just even writing that they bring to the newsroom. And I find that we struggle to retain people because of that. And I'm wondering if you've thought about that element of it, and like how you would encourage white newsroom leaders to see the value in that, because it really is bringing value to the newspaper to have that, like, even just different writing style, which, like, may not conform to, you know, their thoughts about either AP style or the type of storytelling that they're used to.
That's a great question. Listening to you, I think back to my first experience in journalism, which was at the Houston Defender, a weekly black newspaper where I got to do some of everything. and also had that early foundation that my voice mattered and my perspective mattered. And I think particularly coming into a newsroom as large as the Post and as established as a young journalist, having that foundation was really helpful and essential. I think in our industry, mentoring, some of that can come from the top, but some of that can come from colleagues and peers who are also reinforcing the value of both the, as you said, the writing style, the perspective, but as I grew as a writer, having an editor who was able to say to me, you know, you're still growing in this respect, but you can find, you bring us stories that other people wouldn't. And that has a lot of value. And she said that in meetings and conversations, I know where it was necessary for that to be said. And so I think, you know, thinking about the questions of allyship there are really important. Obviously, mentoring and building our own networks, that has a lot of value. But what you're saying also speaks to a larger and chewy conversation about ideas around objectivity, identity in newsrooms, how we talk about those things, which of those principles for mainstream media, you know, we need to think about evolving, what's core, and we need to maintain. But I think that those intergenerational and many times intercultural conversations are really, really important. We started to have them in 2020, I feel like, in a more robust way. I love how you talked about the backlash. I said at the time, which was, you know, when the role that I'm in was created, in the midst of that the window is open and we know it's going to close at some point. So while it's open, what can we do?
How can we rush through?
Exactly. What can we get done? Because you know the window will close. And we can get drinks sometimes and talk about all of that. But back to your question, I think just really being engaged in a thoughtful way in helping to continue to move our industry forward. And I love that the Post is full of both traditionalists who would argue you down about objectivity and people who see the origins of those principles and want to have real conversations about how things need to shift. And I think that's part of that cultural conversation within our industry is really necessary.
Yeah, I love what you're saying, Krista, about like having colleagues who mentored you, who were like, even if maybe literally like working somewhere, like some area of your writing, you're still developing there, you're still growing there, but we know that you bring value. Mm-hmm. Like just having this, like you may be like growing in some spaces, you may have like gaps in your background or something in other spaces, but you, a person, bring value and you're wanted here in this newsroom. Just like saying that can have a real impact on a journalist who's starting in the field, who's new in the field, who, you know, even if you're in conflict over some other aspect, like making it clear that someone is valued, that they're not just a token, that they're not, you know, just like a side bit to the production is really important. I think, you know, we've talked about pipeline a bit here too. One of the things about having a pipeline is that it's also not just like, we did some recruiting, now we're bringing people of color into the newsroom. Here we have like 5 new Black interns, great. They're here, that's all. Part of ensuring that your pipeline is real, that people don't just come in and wash out because they feel unprepared or unsupported, is actually being clear about having the resources. Like if you bring someone into the organization because their voice is valued, because the stories that they can find are interesting, but you like want them to be better trained in whatever principles of objectivity or AP style you want, you have to have the resources to train them and then get them to where they're able to produce the sort of work that you're looking for. Because it's too easy to, I think we see this in every newsroom, like, oh, well, we hired these people and then they couldn't do it, and so like we have to get rid of them. Okay, well, that was helpful. Like, thanks for that. Like, what are you going to do to help people succeed? It's not enough to just have them sort of lingering on the sidelines unsupported. What are you going to do to develop them into the journalists that you want for the future, the journalists that are really adding to your publication? And that's the responsibility, not just of them. I mean, I think most people, they get an opportunity, they're excited for it, but it's their managers, it's the publication, it's putting into place those supports. And I mean, I think you also see this with this sort of failed or this unspoken recruiting contact, like, oh, well, we need a new person. My neighbor's daughter is searching for a job, and I'll just she's great, actually. She's so smart. We'll bring this person in. Like, you note that those resources for training are kind of in place because it's like, oh, well, this is like a friend of mine. I'll take this person out to lunch. We talk, we play tennis together on the weekends. Like, we can talk about how to best cover this story, in that time. But for writers who come from a different community or background or who don't have those networks in place, that means that you have to set them up and provide them. Otherwise, they're inherently at a disadvantage.
So I know we got questions very quickly, but what you talked about, Anna, is basically, and I appreciate you saying the voice that is established is the white voice, right? The whiteness is the standard. And in that infrastructure of whiteness, oftentimes when you do diversity in a not meaningful way, what happens is you set up the person of color or the woman or the fill in your blank minority to fail. And I'll give you an example. So New York Times, I still write for them. I was contributing op-ed writer. In the last 3 years, I don't know if you paid attention, there's been an exodus of black talent from editors. And so think about getting to the creme de la creme and just being like, nope, I'm out. And so talking to many of these folks, some of them are my editors, they just said, one by one we're leaving because the environment is not conducive to our long-term success and they're not listening to us. And so imagine New York Times is seen as you made it, right? And then after you make it as a person of color, especially as a woman of color, especially as a black woman, you're like, I'm done. So that's an example of diversity, but when the infrastructure is not there and the leadership is not supporting you, the same talent that comes there says, I am gonna peace out. That's some of the problem that happens when you don't unlearn or if you don't become aware. And thankfully you are and you guys are becoming aware, but that's what happens when you just do this type of superficial token diversity, right? That's why this keyword that people don't like, awareness, what are we talking about? Be aware of what's happening, try to learn, empathize, but people get very threatened when they're introduced with narratives that conflict with their master narrative or stories. The voice or the white voice also, I do want to say this, it impacts us in so many subtle ways when you're a person of color, to the point where you adopt a white voice on television. Without even realizing, so you can appear mainstream, which is another word that means white. And what you have been told as a person of color, and I've been told this many times, is Wajahat, how will your ethnic story appeal to the mainstream? Can you give us an example? Can you prove it? I still have to go through that. And so it also affects language in the newsroom. Let's go talk to a suburban mom. They ain't looking at them. All right, let's go talk to someone from the heartland. Ain't looking at me. Even though we exist in the heartland and we exist in the suburbs, right? Very important. I mean, if you even saw the last 6 years of coverage with the rise of MAGA and Trump and what's happening, let's go talk to Rust Belt diners. I'm I wait for the day that one day they can talk to all the Latinos, immigrants, refugees, and black folks who literally are the workers alongside the white workers in these auto factories, right? They never talk to them, even to this day. It's been 7 years. I literally tweet this once a month. Headline for anyone who's interested. Great story. No one's taking me up on it. So it's one of those situations that if you have allies, now we have to talk about allies now if we're talking about diversity, you need certain allies with power and privilege, whether it's due to wealth, their position, their gender, or their whiteness, usually it's whiteness, just spoiler alert, who then can echo this message. And when they echo this message, I have seen in my humble career that it's worth 4 times as much as my voice. That's just the truth. And I think right now maybe 3 times as much. So it's progress.
All right, we've got 5 questions up, so maybe let's go.
We're gonna go quick. Don't worry,
Yeah,
we got
okay,
you. We'll get them all.
let's-
We'll get them all.
let's-
We got you.
Yeah.
Up next is Meredith McGraw from Politico. And then we've got Zinkley, and then Ryan, and Andrew Egger, and Molly Olmstead. So Meredith, you're up.
Hi, thank you. And Krista, it's nice to meet a Plan 2 grad out in the wild. It's a very rare thing. I wanted to ask you about what you all have seen in terms of being successful in recruiting and, you know, getting diverse people into journalism. You talked about the traditional pipelines that we've seen, but like in what ways can newsrooms actually be thinking about recruitment and getting, you know, different people into newsrooms and into those conversations?
You know, I think the industry has done relatively well with internships, fellowships. They've gotten better and more sophisticated over time. Politico and the Journalism Institute, particularly under Robin Turner, has moved on but has made a big impact in our industry, is a place where we've seen some of that happen. As Christine was mentioning earlier, it is like after you get in, you know, the questions of retention, continued support, are journalists of color thriving in our newsrooms is an important question. And I think, you know, the programmatic piece around some of those early programs falls away relatively quickly. And the same is true, I think, for mid-career journalists, even, you know, continuing to track their careers to some of those top leadership roles. You know, there are great programs that even 20 years ago I experienced. The Washington Association of Black Journalists has a wonderful, which anyone can volunteer for, program for high school journalists, where they, you know, kind of take you through modules. They go on the street and report stories. There are ways to begin to build those networks early, and awesome ways to give back and contribute, you know, to that pipeline. So I would look for opportunities like that if that's something that you're interested in. But again, I think I mean, it was terrible that NPR got rid of their summer internship program. But I think for some of the larger news organizations, that is still a really great way for identifying early talent.
Recruiting magic bullets. It's not exactly easy.
Yeah, I mean, we're trying to keep this one snappy, these next questions, but I think go where the talent is. Don't just wait for it to come to you through your normal pipelines. And like I think this is obvious, or it may feel like obvious recruiting stuff, but like, oh, you want to find journalists of color, like there is NABJ, you know, the National Association of Black Journalists. Like there are all of these conferences in different places for different groups. It would be great if recruiters showed up there and actually not just like, oh, we have a booth and we like sent one junior intern there to man the booth. But again, like actually put in the resources to going and seeking applicants from these different areas, whether that means like not just recruiting from the same 7 colleges, but like having an active recruiting program that goes to HBCUs, or goes to community colleges, or, you know, even like, I don't know, polls like religious organizations in a region or area to like find out if there are any working journalists that happen to be in the congregation who want to submit a piece. It just takes, I think, stepping out of what's the easiest. It's just way easier to be like, okay, well, we send our usual person to Harvard to recruit from the Lampoon and like the Harvard Journal, like that's what we do. Unfortunately, you also have to take the step to make it normative to recruit from all the other places where all the other journalists live.
Meaningful diversity, just like a meaningful relationship, requires reciprocity. And oftentimes it's the person of color doing all the work, and sometimes you need a hand to reach across the aisle. So as Christine was saying, if you really care about this and the people in positions of power cared, it would take them 17 minutes on Google to research these organizations that have been doing the work, like SAJA and like National Association of Black Journalists. Like there's so many. And then after you make an Excel sheet, that'll take you like 6 minutes. Then you search the other website for 7 minutes, you get the contact, that's 13 minutes. And then you make an intern call and set up an appointment with that person. And now in 40 minutes, you have now an Excel sheet of like 15 journalist centers that will then do all the work for you because they've already done the work. It's good. It's good. It's good.
I mean, I think effective allyship from peers. I mean, actually, I think Krista and Wash were giving like good examples of this. It's a sort of the metaphor that's coming to mind as a person who doesn't really play sports is volleyball. I don't know, like someone has hit the ball into the air. The ball is like there. It is not just the person's responsibility. Like the whole team needs to get behind them to like keep it in the air, right? Is that how volleyball works? I don't really know. We can move on from that.
We're gonna run with it. We got it.
Yeah, sure, whatever.
Sure.
But I mean, effective allyship is, noting this fact that unfortunately, as what you said, like a person of color or a minority or a woman, like they may say something, and then when it's echoed by their white colleague, suddenly everyone's like, "Oh, that's a great point." When I said it, it was just like, "Thanks." Like being an ally means like noticing when that's happening and being, if you're a person who has that respect or has that power, it means stepping up and being the echoer, simply being the one like, oh, I love the point that Matthew made. Can we like go back to that? Looking for initiatives maybe where your peers of color, your peers from underrepresented backgrounds need support and making it your business to be supportive. Whether it's nominating people for projects, whether it's even just being like, oh, this person helped me write this, can we add them to the byline? It is, I think, the simple gestures of just making sure that the people around you are seen, not just you. I think that's, from a peer-to-peer level, that's what effective allyship has always looked like to me.
I would say speaking up, and I'll give you a personal example, right? We all have our blind spots, myself included. So even though I'm a person of color, Muslim, I care about these issues. As a human being, we have our blind spots. Privilege is oftentimes blind to its power and its own abuses of power, right? So as a man, as a straight man, I could tell you, like years ago, struggling writer, trying my best, single, just the usual, wearing the same jacket, hustling. I now have another jacket, ladies and gentlemen. So I only had a black jacket, but now have a navy blue jacket as well. So, I was just trying my best, and I remember women came up to me and they said, how come you're always on these manels? And I'm like, what the hell's a manel? And they're like, it's all male panels. I'm like, what? And they're like, yeah, you should use your privilege to like speak up. Now, this is what happens. No one admits this. When someone confronts you with this, your first reaction as human beings is to get defensive. So I didn't say this out loud, but then internally I was like, what are you talking about? You don't know me. You don't know my story. I'm struggling to support my parents. I'm broke. I'm like, no one's helping me out. But outwardly, I'm like, yes, okay, sure. Yes, I'll help, right? Frustrated. But then what happened? I go see, and I'm like, these women are onto something. These are all male panels. How come I never saw it before? Because I didn't see, because my privilege as a man blinded. This is how things were done, Josh. There was like it was 3 dudes, a token woman. Or oftentimes it was 4 dudes. So now that I became aware, I'm like, wow, they're onto something. Okay. Then I made the intention. So the intention I made a couple years ago was like, I will try my best to never be part of a manel again. I'm not a hero. Okay, there's no I'm not a martyr. But I said I can at least do that. And it has come to a point several times in the past couple of years, straight up, all dudes. And I said to the organizer, you need to have at least 1 woman or 2 women. This is a bad look. If you need women, I can give you brilliant women who I know. And to the point, there was one time in DC, it was about 2 years ago, where they're like, no, we're gonna go ahead with it. So then I said, well, it's a good opportunity, but I have to stick to my intention and my mission. So I said, I'm gonna back out. And they're like, why are you doing this? You just, you're trying to make yourself look better and like this and that. I'm like, no, this you have to have, this is terrible. The year is 2021, you cannot do this. And they got 2 brilliant women on the panel, right? So did my career suffer? No. I'm doing pretty well. I've been invited to the Darcy to address the future journalists. They gave me free coffee. The conversation became better. the women were appreciative. And what I also realized is this, and this is an important thing to say, because especially in the DEI landscape, people don't want to speak out because they don't want to step on landmines, they don't want to be attacked. And so what happens instead of us having the uncomfortable conversations is people retreat and they stay quiet, and it builds resentment and guilt and anger, right? What happened is those women who said that to me initially, they came back and thanked me because it wasn't about me. They were angry about a system that deprived them of a voice. And once they saw me step up, they thank you for listening. I hope that is an example that lands for some folks.
I think these were great answers. I'll do two quick things. One, I think it's important for us to remember, particularly for those of you who are in print, that so much of what we do is actually skill-based. I mean, there's some people who are just born gifted, brilliant writers, which is amazing. And then put your 10,000 hours in and you can learn it. And so being that ghost editor colleague to talk through a story with someone else is something that we can all do. It makes you sharper, it makes them sharper. And then to the part of your question about who's most at risk, I would just look around and see who is the only. It's always someone, and maybe they're on a different team, and maybe it's a really tricky subject area, but we all share in this crazy adrenaline fueled, a fire just happened, oh my goodness, what are we gonna do? And so jumping into the fray, even if they just need to talk about how difficult it is to cover that thing, particularly if they're covering it in terms of their own community, is a really important role we can all play.
It's like school, right? It's like being that new kid in school. If
Yeah.
you've ever been in school when I was picked on wearing husky pants, and you look back and you're like, man, I wish I just had one friend or someone who was nice to me. Sure. I think that if you could go back to that, remember that one moment in school when I was picked on, and it would just been really nice if someone just didn't pick on me, looked out for me.
Yep.
That would have really helped.
It's good. Who's the only? Ryan Struck, CNN.
Thanks so much for doing this. My question is about just a slightly different angle on this, which is how DEI has become a story that we cover in some ways, in that we have Ron DeSantis banning DEI efforts in Florida, we have banning CRT, this has just become a whole story that we cover as part of our jobs too. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on how to do that well.
Go for it.
I mean, I think bringing the same rigor as that we always have to stories about culture. One of the things that we've talked about in our newsroom is not adopting the politicized language as just par for the course. We got to a point where it was the zingy thing to throw woke into every headline, and I'm like, woke banking? Are we really doing that? Let's be thoughtful and remember how much power language has, and unpack those things contextualized in stories, bringing the rigor of our reporting to all of those things. And so when DEI and CRT just become these acronyms that are devoid of definition of what these practices and this academic theory actually are, then we're doing a disservice to our readers and just kind of playing into a politicized conversation. And so I think, again, just bringing rigorous reporting to those stories is the best thing that we can do as journalists.
Yeah, to the not falling into the language trap, if you think about just where this conversation has emerged in large part, Chris Rufo, right, from the Manhattan Institute, outlined online, on Twitter, on the internet, that his actual plan was to take the word, the phrase CRT, and take the word woke and contaminate them and use them so much that everything was subsumed under, everything that people don't like is now subsumed under those words. That was the plan. So by just taking those usages at face value, we're just falling in line with the plan. And it's come on guys, the plan is out there, don't follow the plan.
He's literally telling you.
He's literally telling you what he's doing, don't do it. But I also think, and I think it's also really valuable for journalists, for news outlets who still do have like some credibility and also the space to do this, to actually talk to people and make the real definitions clear to push back against that false norming. But another way to cover it, so actually the last piece I published that came out last week was about Ron DeSantis and higher ed reforms in Florida. So I went down to the University of Florida. And the thing I think that was unique about this particular piece is that I went down to the University of Florida and I just asked students and I asked faculty members to give me their opinions, and like they actually ended up writing them out kind of on note cards. And I wrote the piece, but we also published as many of these just note cards of the people who are being affected by this situation. Like, it's really easy to talk about like DEI and CRT and wokeness in sort of this airy-fairy language where it's all about the concepts. But when it really comes down to it, we're covering it because these changes affect real lives. You know, and we can talk about how dangerous DEI is or how not dangerous it is or whatever. But like the way to actually find out what it means is by talking to the real people who are affected and highlighting their voices. I think it's more useful to talk to people. Like I just think more sort of reporting on the ground, those who are affected by these changes and hearing what they have to say and pushing them if necessary to really explain what they mean brings a lot more color to the conversation than just like the constant wheel of woke or not woke enough or DEI, not DEI enough. Also like being really clear on the data. So there's an interesting piece, I think it was the Post yesterday. I read like a lot of newspapers on Sunday. Sometimes I get confused. About University of Virginia and pushback by like some alumni of the university about how the university was getting too woke. And one of the interesting things and really useful, was that the Post?
Times.
Oh, sorry.
I think we
Such a good paper.
We had
yeah,
done it
yeah.
first. We did.
Shame.
But, like, just really embarrassing to say. One of the really interesting things and like valuable things I found about that story was that it kind of outlined the conflict, what people were saying. It noted that this alumni group, they called themselves the Jefferson Council, was making these wild accusations like the University of Virginia spent $40 million on DEI and where is it going? And they have 90 DEI executives and this is terrible. And the article cleanly made the point, note it's actually 40 people instead of 90, or no, this number is not actually supported. The spending is much less. And being able to put facts into the narrative, like things that people can actually grasp rather than just like going back and forth on the terms, I think is far more useful.
So we have two more. Are y'all still with us? Are you bored? No? It's been a long day. They just keep you trapped here. Listen to us, folks. I would always put in quotation marks, CRT and woke, because I think oftentimes they don't, and what happens is the definition of Christopher Rufo becomes the mainstream definition, which has unfortunately happened, and I've been trying to warn about this for 2 years. And literally what Christine said is like this guy, like, you know, it's like a Bond, you ever watch Bond movies? And it takes like James Bond 2 hours to get to the villain, and the villain goes, "Let me tell you my master plan, Bond." Like, this is literally in the first 10 minutes where Christopher Rufo is like, "Let me give you the slideshow and my quotes." And then we just mainstream press just went along with it because the standard still is whiteness. I would put in quotation marks. The second thing I would do, I would love for everyone to do, is just ask the people against wokeness and CRT to define it. Each and every single time. And you think, oh, that's too easy. I guarantee you those clips will go viral. They already have. Ask them just like simple. Don't be an ass about it. Just be like, by wokeness, what do you mean? What do you mean by CRT? And watch the fireworks. No one does that. Like, very few people actually do that. I just think it's an easy win that like journalists can do with that they haven't done. They just take it as default. The third thing, which Christine was talking about, and I just want to double down on, is if you do care about both sides, you have to then bring in Black and brown parents also. And so Moms of Liberty, they did this big CBS morning news show did this big piece on it. It was trending yesterday. Some people were wondering like, oh my God, Moms for Liberty, this is a scary go. Other people were saying, why did you give a platform for Moms for Liberty? But what was missing also from that was, why aren't we interviewing Black and brown parents who are being affected by the activities of Moms for Liberty, you know, and also what I would like to hear from are white moms who are against Moms for Liberty, because in the absence of that, you get the assumption that all Christian moms are like this, all white Christian moms are like this, right? But I would really like the emphasis to be like I would love to hear some Black and brown and Asian moms, given that platform that they were denied. That gives you the more thorough story. It gives you the context. It connects the dots for people. It gives you the history. And I think if you just ask them to define it, you'll find out what they're really against. Too soon?
Yeah, no, I mean, to circle like way back, like I think what all of us are saying in some ways that there's real value to not just being like, oh, there's a conflict about DEI. It's what value we can add is unpacking the story.
Yeah.
Like not just talk about DEI, but what do you mean by diversity? What's the problem with equity? What's wrong? Like what is good or bad about inclusion? Like what's the definition here?
Who's affected?
Yeah, who's affected? Not just batting the terms back and forth.
Molly Olmsted from Slate.
Hi.
All the questions.
So I don't know if I'm going to be able to articulate this question well, but I'm thinking about how journalists who, you know, are having to cover these topics that obviously can be like quite personal as well. And so we're often talking about if you are, you know, covering racism and you are like having to internalize that, you're also, you know, you're not just talking about a journalistic issue, you're also talking about being a worker and it being a workplace. And also when you get, you know, a certain at least generation of journalists, I think we're really into the idea of free speech. So there's this idea that you can just bat these ideas around and talk about these things. And it all falls into the category of free speech without necessarily thinking about, am I cultivating like a healthy workplace where everyone feels comfortable and good? And so I'm wondering like how useful you found it to try and talk about things in terms of like, oh, this isn't a matter of like censorship or whatever. We're talking about things as a workplace issue. Like we are talking about these journalists as employees who shouldn't be harassed by having their like coworkers, you know, banding about, I don't know, ideas about, you know, that are ultimately inherently racist. Like, is that a useful way to talk about it as like as a workplace issue? Or is that a wrong way to go about thinking about some of these things?
About the tension between sort of like free speech concerns, like we have to be able to have this debate in public, this is what we do, and you know, saying that, okay, these are colleagues or coworkers, meaning they're like human people. I mean, I think there is a conflict here. I mean, there is truth to the fact that like certain discussions, certain circumstances can take a toll on someone's mental health or well-being. Like they can contribute to burnout. I mean, I don't know if I had this experience during the George Floyd protest, Chris. I think a lot of people in our newsroom were like, you know, I'm a journalist. I did sign up for this. Like, this is my job. On the other hand, I don't love watching a replay of people who look like my family members being murdered all day. Like, that's my job, but it's harder than it usually is for this to be my job. Like, instead of me being able to be like on top of things 8 hours a day, doing this 8 hours a day, like maybe I can only watch these videos for 4 hours a day. Maybe I need to take a long weekend, actually, because like this is just, for me, harder than it normally is. And I think it's important for leaders, for bosses, for mentors, for colleagues to just like recognize that that can be the case. I mean, I think that I've had this experience a lot, like not even in just extreme circumstances, kind of like this one, but there is a certain tone deafness and blindness. And this is also, I think, something that allies really need to be aware of. And just like, it takes practice, but like to check yourself just a little bit, to like try and read the room. It's a privilege to not have to read the room, frankly. It's a real privilege to just being able to like go nuts and say what you want with no consequences. But just like, okay, this is like free speech. We have to be able to talk about everything. So I want to talk about whether there are major IQ differences between black people and white people. And like, read the room. You know, there are certain times and places where like you can set the boundaries for this discussion. You're discussing whether a piece needs to run. You're discussing whether you want to commission a piece on something. Yeah, there is like, okay, this is a piece. It exists in the world. But there is something to be said for considering what impact that has on your colleagues, their ability to do work, what impact that has on your organization, what it looks like when you're suddenly the outlet that's like publishing these wildly insensitive pieces and defending them on like, oh, well, like everyone has to have a say. Like, you are a news organization. The point of being a news organization is that you choose what you publish and you choose what you don't publish. And while there are debates around that, like, be open about the fact that you're having those debates and realize what the debates might look and feel like for different people in your organization, not just you. And I mean, I think this is just an ongoing conversation, right? Like, if you sign up to be a journalist and you sign up to cover the news, you are ostensibly signing up to cover unpleasant news, things that you don't agree with, things that might have an emotional valence that's unpleasant for you. That's part of the job. But if you're hiring someone for that job, also respect them by giving them the support that they need to do the job, by recognizing that they have limits and, you know, being aware of those, by, again, just like reading the room and checking your own privilege and realizing that what sounds like or feels like a like, well, like, I'm just being a devil's advocate here, like, you know, we're just having like an open back and forth, like, might feel casual to you, but there are other people for whom it might not feel that casual, frankly. And I think there's another debate to be had too about kind of the infiltration of what some are describing as kind of like trauma and harm terminology in newsrooms and in public spaces, where people are like, well, I don't want to talk about that because it's traumatic for me, or like, I think that what you're saying causes me harm. And frankly, I think that that is often overused. But again, there's discussion to be had on these topics. And even if you disagree with someone's utilization of a term like trauma or harm, or their unwillingness to have a conversation, the first thing that you should try and do, I think, is to just put yourself in their shoes a little bit and to think of them not as an ideological opponent or even just like another worker machine that sits a couple desks down from you, but as a person. Because at the end of the day, that's what we all are. And as journalists, we're trying to represent people for people.
That's great. Krista, closing comment from you?
But these were great and thoughtful answers to your question. I mean, I think that what I would add is I do think newsroom leaders are more thoughtful about the stress and trauma of being a journalist today, and that is like, that's not a conversation that was being had 5-10 years ago, but that is taking place now. You know, I think the idea and some of this in setting norms about how we engage on social media and some of our internal channels for conversation, all of those things are important. What I encourage is, if you see something, say something. Speaking up is so valuable. My early career was shaped soon after Hurricane Katrina, and you know, it was one of those stories where you're sending so many journalists to cover this huge event. And I remember in those early headlines, the term refugees was applied to people in New Orleans who were fleeing their own city. That was their home. They were not refugees. They were evacuating. They were evacuees. And I think it was a news aide maybe who pointed out on our internal message system that word was being misused in that case. Not a person who was sitting in a seat of power, the people who were, you know, calling the shots, and they didn't notice that. But the idea that we can all inform the cultural accuracy of our report, and sometimes that means first you're offended by a thing that you see, but then you say it, and you can see it change in real time because you have access to a conversation that our readers don't have, and just remembering that is, because of what we do, a lever, a button that you can then push in it. So it's worth speaking up in those circumstances.
Wonderful. Thank you, Christine Emba, Krista Thompson, and Wajahat Ali. Thanks, you guys, very much.